Hello, everyone. We really appreciate you taking the time to be here today. My name is Veronica Guadagni, and I'm a senior research scientist here at Cerebra. Cerebra is a Canadian technology company that is transforming the future of sleep diagnosis and therapy. Cerebra unites innovators and researchers with the common goal and passion of putting sleep back into sleep medicine. And this is why we put together the Catching Up on Sleep webinar series, where we bring you hot topics in the sleep presented by researchers on the cutting edge of sleep science that refuse to hit the snooze button. And today, Dr. Ali is an example of this. First of all, a few housekeeping items. So we have a Q&A function where you can input your questions. You can do this through the presentation or just at the end, and then I will moderate the session. We really value your feedback, so please fill out the anonymous evaluation form, which I will provide in the chat as soon as I'm done with these initial thoughts. And then this talk would be eligible for continuing education credits. We will have a link to the survey that will provide an email for the certificate of completion at the end of the evaluation. Further, we have other Catching Up on Sleep webinars. This will be in a bit of time. So September 20, we'll have Dr. Els van der Helm. And then November 16, we will have Dr. Olivia Walsh. So you have time to register for the next webinars. But our speaker for today is Dr. Ali Azarbarzin. He's an assistant professor of medicine at Harvard University and the director of Sleep Apnea Outcomes Research Group. He's also the lead investigator for the Division of Sleep and Circadian Disorder at the Brigham and Women's Hospital. Dr. Azarbarzin research is interested in sleep apnea physiology, epidemiology, and health consequences. The focus of his work is to better understand physiological consequences of sleep apnea, including hypoxia, sleep fragmentation, and sympathetic activation, and how they relate to health outcomes. He's also interested in identifying individual patients who benefit most from intervention. So without further ado, welcome Dr. Azarbarzin, and we're happy to have you here today.
Thank you so much for the introduction. Let me just share my screen. Can you see my screen? No?
Yes, we can perfectly.
Okay. Let's start this. Okay. Hello, everyone. Thank you for inviting me to share our research. And the title of my talk is Characterization of Sleep Apnea Beyond the Apnea-Hypopnea Index, or AHI. Okay, so this slide shows my disclosure. These studies that I'm presenting today ultimately have been funded by AHA, NIH, and other foundations. And another disclosure that I have is this is really a growing field, and many groups, including some in Winnipeg, Dr. Eunice and others across Canada, are working in this area. And I acknowledge all their great contribution. However, in this presentation, I'm mostly focusing on the research coming out of our lab. So I'll start with some background on the limitation of the current approaches involving OSA diagnosis and management. Then I will talk about hypoxic burden, its calculation, association with outcomes, and then I'll move to the topic of heart rate response to respiratory events. And at the end, if time allows, I'll talk about arousal intensity. So this slide shows a 4-minute PSG tracing of obstructive sleep apnea events. So as you see, with each apnea, the absence of airflow is accompanied by out-of-phase movements of thorax and abdomen and large intrathoracic pressure swings, and a decrease in oxygen saturation, as you see here. At the end of the apnea, the termination of the events are usually accompanied by arousal from sleep and an increase in heart rate that you can see in this example here. However, so the transitioning back to sleep is actually associated with another collapse and the recurrent obstructive apnea, as you see here. However, the OSA severity is simply measured by counting the number of events, apneas and hypopneas per hour of sleep. And by definition, the AHI ignores all these physiological disturbances that happen over and over during sleep. Observational studies have shown a strong association between OSA and daytime function, as well as several cardiometabolic outcomes, including hypertension, diabetes, atrial fibrillation, heart failure, and so on. For example, depending on the AHI cutoff, the prevalence of OSA in these cardiovascular condition is very different. For example, 83% of individuals with hypertension have an AHI greater than 5 events per hour. In individuals with excessive daytime sleepiness, CPAP is often prescribed to improve daytime sleepiness and symptoms. However, there is controversy whether CPAP should be prescribed for the purpose of CVD, of secondary CVD risk reduction in non-sleepy OSA. Observational studies have shown a strong association have shown actually that CPAP is beneficial. However, these RCTs that you see in this slide have not been able to detect the benefit of CPAP. And one reason for the NOIL findings in these RCTs is inadequate patient selection by the apnea-hypopnea index. And because AHI is not able to capture the physiological disturbances that occur during sleep, so we think that the inclusion of milder form of OSA in this trial have led to dilution of the true effect of CPAP in the high-risk individuals. And as you see here in this figure here, for any given AHI on the x-axis, there are variations in the event characteristics, including event severity measures like event duration, depths, and as well as desaturation, duration, and depths, and also in the physiological responses like changes in heart rate, blood pressure, and as well as changes in brain activity or EEG. How about other metrics of OSA severity? They actually share similar limitations. For example, just giving an example of ODI, it's just, again, it's the number of desaturation beyond a threshold of 3 or 4% per hour of sleep, and there is no information on the depth and duration of desaturation beyond these thresholds. And the same applies to arousal index. It doesn't capture the strength of arousal from sleep. Minimum SpO2, which often is reported on PSG, it oversimplified the dynamic of desaturation into one number. And there is another metric which is a bit more useful, but it's also limited. T90 or percent time with SpO2 below 90%. It can actually be easily obtained from sleep studies. However, the issue with T90 is that it's not specific to OSA, and it's based on an arbitrary threshold of 90%. And as you see in this example, if I keep the intermittent hypoxemia portion or component of the T90 constant and just lower the baseline saturation, you see that the value of T90 goes from 29% all the way to 100% without changing the intermittent hypoxia component of T90. Obviously, you can argue that the person with 100% T90 has a higher risk of CVD, for example. However, we think that the risk is not related to OSA and is probably related to other underlying causes of sustained hypoxemia. And therefore, if you include individuals based on T90 and try to look at the effect of CPAP, you probably you cannot. So there would be some mixing of the effect of other conditions that's captured by T90. Okay, another problem with T90 is the sensitivity of T90 to measurement error. So, for example, this is just I'm exaggerating here, but the idea is that if baseline SpO2 is fluctuating around 90%, any drift or artifact could actually substantially change the value of T90 from 0% to 100%. So it's sensitive to measurement error as well. Okay, so if we assume that OSA consists of several discrete respiratory events, we are missing useful information with just counting those events. And so what else can be added? So in this figure that you see on the right, I'm showing an ensemble average of different signals that we calculated during sleep. So on the top, you see the ventilation, minute ventilation, that you have a decrease in minute ventilation during the events. And then you have ventilatory overshoot upon airway opening. And you also see the desaturation associated with those reduction in airflow, as well as increase in heart rate and blood pressure. So if you look at this figure, we can actually quantify these characteristics: event-related ventilative deficit, or we call it ventilative burden, event-related hypoxemia or hypoxic burden, and event-related changes in heart rate or blood pressure, which you can describe it as autonomic arousal, and event-related changes in EEG, or the magnitude of changes in EEG characteristic, which we call it arousal intensity. So I'll start with hypoxic burden. So one way actually to incorporate the depth and duration of events is to measure the area under the desaturation curve. However, sometimes it's difficult to find the start and end of the desaturation. So we decided to design a search window, a subject-specific search window based on the respiratory events. So what you see here, so it's a two-step process. First, we go through each event and we find the end of the event. And then we look at the SpO2 signal around that event termination point. And we do it for all the other events. And then at the end, so time zero for each event is defined the end or termination of the events. And at the end, you can just overlay these signals on top of each other and get an average curve of the desaturation for each subject. So once you have that, then the second step is just to go through each event and use that search window, which is very critical to not overestimate, for example, when there is an incomplete recovery in SpO2. So to get a better estimate of the area under the curve for each DSAT. Once we have that, we calculate the area under each DSAT, and then we sum them up and divide by total sleep time. So you can estimate hypoxic burden by just looking at this average curve. So if you look at this average curve, and then you can just estimate it by a triangle. And this is the average area per event, average desaturation area per event. So if you multiply that by the number of events that were analyzed, number of events per hour, so you can get an estimate of hypoxic burden. Okay, so that was the calculation of hypoxic burden. So there is a substantial variability for any given AHI. Obviously, because both AHI and hypoxic burden, they measure OSA severity, they are correlated. However, as AHI increases, the events have the opportunity to become different from one another. For example, at an AHI of 30, HB ranges from 50 to 150 per centiminute per hour. So an HB of 50 is equivalent to 10 minutes of 5% desaturation per hour of sleep. Here in this slide, I'm showing the average curve of SpO2, the way that we calculate it, for 6 different individuals. On the top, you see that everybody has a moderate AHI at around 15 events per hour, and there is a very different desaturation pattern. And the same thing for individual with severe OSA, but different desat pattern. So we think that these people with a lot of hypoxemia are increased risk of CVD and other bad outcomes. Okay, how about the comparison with T90? So again, at any T90, there is a substantial variability, as you see here. So they're not very well correlated in majority of the cases. On the left here, for example, T90 does not capture the contribution of intermittent hypoxemia. And there is a wide range of hypoxic burden here. That T90 is just not sensitive to. On the other hand, if you look at these people with a high value on T90, but low number of hypoxic burden, so we think that these people, the risk may not be related to OSA. And these people could probably may not benefit from CPAP in terms of their cardiovascular risk reduction. Okay, so that was the some background on hypoxic burden. So now I move to association of hypoxic burden with health outcome. We started to look at the original study we did. It was in 2018. We looked at CVD mortality in 2 different cohorts, observational cohorts. The first one, Mr. Oz, which is an older cohort of about only men, 2,700, average age of 76 years. And they were followed for an average of 10 years, and there were 440 CVD-related deaths in this cohort. And the second cohort was more than 5,000 individuals, middle-aged or older adults, 53% women, and average age of 64 years, followed for about 11 years, and 313 CVD-related deaths were observed in this cohort. And as you see here, hypoxic burden was associated with CVD mortality, both in unadjusted and fully adjusted models. And so the area under desaturation curve has been used before. A group from Finland actually developed a metric called desaturation severity parameter. The main difference with hypoxic burden is the use of subject-specific search window that we used to guide the area calculation. And actually we compared the 2 metrics in a sleep heart health. We did this study in 2020. And so as you see here, this is the desaturation severity. In an adjusted model, the hazard ratio was almost 1 for this metric, while hypoxic burden predicted in a head-to-head comparison with this metric. Okay, so in addition to our group, so people from France, they used this French cohort and measured hypoxic burden, and they looked at the association of hypoxic burden with major adverse cardiovascular events in a clinical cohort with OSA and without any CVD at baseline, with median follow-up of about 78 months. This is the outcomes that they looked at. About 592 subjects had the primary endpoint, and they found a similar association between hypoxic burden and major adverse cardiovascular events. So it's validated independently from our group in France. So in several cross-sectional analysis, we actually looked at hypoxic burden and blood pressure and also chronic kidney disease. So hypoxic burden was associated with blood pressure in this study, which was published in 2021. And in another study, we looked at the prevalence ratio of moderate to severe chronic kidney disease. And there was a significant association between hypoxic burden and CKD, while there was nothing with apnea-hypopnea index. And other groups actually, they also looked at measures of area under the saturation curve, and these are some recent publications. And for example, this one, they found that it was related to daytime sleepiness better than AHI, and so on, similar association in other studies as well. Okay, so we, with help of Siesta group, we actually created a free web application to calculate the hypoxic burden, and this is the website. So you need to create an account and then just upload the EDF to this software, and it will give you the values of hypoxic burden. This method is actually slightly different than the published algorithms that we have. It relies on automated scoring of sleep and respiratory events that were provided by a Somnolizer. So the method may be slightly different, but we tested this. It's correlated with the original hypoxic burden that we published on. So the take-home message is that hypoxic burden is a cumulative measure of OSA-related intermittent hypoxemia. It's associated with adverse cardiometabolic outcomes and can be easily calculated from PSG and home sleep tests. Okay, so now I move on to the next topic, which is heart rate response to respiratory events. So the literature on cardiovascular reactivity in the field of stress and emotion is very rich. For example, research has shown that individuals with exaggerated CV response to stress in situations such as public speaking or cold pressure test are at increased risk of future CVD. In OSA, respiratory events can be considered as a physiologic stressor. Indeed, older research in this area has shown that the opening of an airway that has been obstructed for some time is associated with ventilatory and hemodynamic changes that could actually lead to physiologic responses, including change in heart rate and blood pressure. And the magnitude of response is a function of preceding respiratory event severity, including depth and duration, and as well as subject-specific responsiveness. So heart rate is readily available in the sleep study, but really it's underutilized. So in 2013, we showed that the magnitude of increase in heart rate is associated with the severity of the events. So events with arousal had the highest increase in heart rate. But if you look at events without arousals, and if you look at if you compare the magnitude of decrease in airflow or ventilation and change in heart rate, there was a graded response. As you increase the severity of the event, you see a larger increase in heart rate. How about between individual? On average, some people have just larger increase in heart rate than others. And here you see two examples. In the top, you see the apneas and the desaturation, and here you see the increase in heart rate. For the similar amount of reduction in airflow, this individual in the bottom has a larger increase in heart rate. So we were interested to look at this and see what it means, if it has any predictive ability in terms of cardiovascular outcome or not. So our hypothesis was that higher heart rate response, or delta heart rate, is associated with increased risk of cardiovascular disease. And our second hypothesis was that if you remove respiratory stimuli, which are apneas and hypopneas by CPAP, then you can see, you can actually identify subgroup of people who benefit from CPAP. So we used two observational cohorts to look at our, to test our hypothesis. The first one was the MESA cohort, which included about 1,400 individuals who had enough number of respiratory events to calculate heart rate response. And the second cohort was the sleep quartiles. So we used the MESA to look at some cross-sectional association with some subclinical CVD biomarkers, and then we tested the metrics and the threshold in the sleep quartiles study. So we observed a U-shaped association between delta heart rate and subclinical CVD measure. And as you see here, very low heart rate response. There was increased value, increased risk of these, Framingham CVD risk score, the CAC score, and also the NT-proBNP, and as well as in individuals with very high delta heart rate. Based on these observations, in a continuous form, we categorize heart rate response to three groups: less than 25%, the low and the mid group 25 to 75, and the high group more than 75 percentile. So after this, we tested this threshold, the same threshold that were obtained from the MESA study we used in the sleep heart health study, and we looked at the longitudinal outcomes, including non-fatal CVD, CVD mortality, and all-cause mortality. And as you see here, both low and high delta heart rate group were at increased risk of CVD and mortality. Okay. Again, there was I found similar findings from stress research. For example, this paper, they showed that blunted as well as exaggerated cardiovascular reactivity to stress is associated with negative health outcomes. This research, actually, this paper from Europe was published a few or maybe a couple of weeks ago in Blue Journal, showing that individuals with low pulse wave drop index were at increased risk of, these people here who don't have any response in their PPG, they were at increased risk of adverse CVD outcomes. And the conclusion was that low value of this index reflect poor CV reactivity and therefore was associated with increased CVD. Comparing with our data, we think that the people with low pulse wave drop index are those shown in the left tail of the delta heart rate group. the take-home message here is that individual with low and high delta heart rate with increased risk of CVD, the risk observing the low delta heart rate group, we think it's non-OSA specific, probably due to heart disease, diabetes, autonomic dysfunction, and the risk observed in the high delta heart rate group may be OSA specific, and why we concluded this way, because we observe higher hazard ratio in those with severe OSA, quantified by either AHI or hypoxic, and its risk actually was exclusively observed in those with an ESS less than 11. So this subsequent question was, would CPAP reduce the risk in those with high delta heart rate? That's the second hypothesis that we tried to test. And for that, we used the RICATSA trial. So RICATSA trial was originally published in Blue Journal in 2016, a negative trial that they didn't find any benefit of CPAP in terms of long-term CVD risk reduction. So patients with coronary artery disease and OSA, AHI greater than 15, and forced sleepiness scale less than 10, they were enrolled to either, they were randomized to CPAP or no CPAP, and they were followed for about 57 months. And the primary endpoint was the first event of repeat revascularization, MI, stroke, or cardiovascular mortality. So what we saw was that so basically this is the point estimate. So this is the average. So if there is an average, if you have an average delta heart rate of about maybe 6 beats per minute, that's the effect of CPAP. And that's similar to what the overall sample in RICATSA was shown, basically. So it was similar finding. However, if you look at the higher delta heart rates, that's one standard deviation above the mean, you see a significant risk reduction. And if you look at the lower delta heart rate, there is a suggestion of harm of using CPAP in this group. And so if you do the subgroup analysis, just look at the CPAP effect in those with low delta heart rate, less than 6 beats per minute, versus those with more than 6 beats per minute. You see a differential effect of CPAP. So there's a significant risk reduction in the high delta heart rate group. So so this study is actually an interesting study that partly supports the that heart rate response to respiratory events is probably a measure of sympathetic activity rather than parasympathetic activity. So what they've done here, this is they measure this heart rate response in a similar fashion that we did, and they looked at OSA without Parkinson and OSA with Parkinson's disease, and they controlled for the event severity. They just looked at the delta heart rate. So as you see, there was no significant difference in terms of the event severity, like duration of respiratory events, the drop in SpO2, or the timing of the decrease in SpO2. So they were similar between the Parkinson with OSA and no Parkinson, no OSA control. However, if you look at the increase in heart rate, there was the non-Parkinson disease group had a much larger increase in heart rate, which suggests that this is probably in patient with OSA and Parkinson's disease, cardiovascular reactivity is suppressed due to degeneration of the sympathetic nervous system. Okay, so the take-home messages from this data is that greater heart rate response to respiratory events is a risk factor that is identifiable, deleterious, and potentially reversible, and could potentially be used to select patients most likely to exhibit long-term cardiovascular benefit from CPAP treatment. So I'll just go quickly over this last section, which is related to arousal intensity, and then I'll be done. So the definition of arousal, if you look at the ASM criteria, is an abrupt shift in EEG to higher frequency, including alpha, theta, beta, for at least 3 seconds with a 10-second of sleep, stable sleep preceding the change. But if you look at the visual appearance of arousal, it varies from barely meeting the scoring criteria to very intense arousal with drastic changes in EEG. So here I'm showing some examples of within a subject, you see different arousals with different intensity. So right now, all these arousal are considered, are just counted together to calculate arousal index. So what we did was we applied a machine learning method to quantify the magnitude of change in EEG in about 20 individuals in 2014. And we use heart rate response to arousal for validation. In addition, we created sham arousal, 10 to 14 sham arousal per subject, and calculated the arousal intensity to just for further validation of the methods. And this is just an example of the output of the algorithm. So it just gave, so the arousal intensity is actually a value between 0 and 9, 9 being the most intense. So I gave a value of 1 for this one, 3, 6, and 9 for these arousals. If you look at just the distribution of arousal intensity, most of the arousals are 3 or 2 to 4, range of 2 to 4. So really, we don't know whether they have any so whether there is a difference between, so if someone has a lot of these arousal, that's different than someone who has just a lot of these milder arousals. And in the control group, in the sham arousal, this is the results. So majority of them, about 74%, were scored as 0, and then about 11% 2, and then none of them were scored greater than 2, further validating the method. If you look at the arousal within an individual, look at arousal intensity and heart rate response, you see that everyone within an individual, an average increase in arousal intensity was associated with an increase in heart rate response. However, the slope of the relationship was substantially different across individuals. And in another study involving 28 healthy young adults, we found that the intensity of arousal were reproducible on repeat testing. So these were some subsequent studies to just further look at the arousal intensity and further examine it. In an unpublished study, we were interested to look at the association with daytime sleepiness. So excessive daytime sleepiness were greater than 10 was associated with increased risk of car accident. What we did was that we measured arousal intensity from sleep quartiles study in those who had adequate quality of EEG, about 4,300 individual AHI greater than 5, and we use a logistic regression analysis, ESS greater than 11 as the dependent variable. We adjusted for these confounders. And what you see here is the quartile of arousal intensity for different subject characteristics. And as you see, if for the higher quartile, the arousal index, so there is a decrease in arousal index as you go to the higher quartile, the same for AHI. However, if you look at delta heart rate, desat area per event, or desat slope, so this group in the high arousal intensity, they're just more severe form of respiratory events. And this is in a continuous fashion. If you look at arousal intensity and arousal index, so there is a negative correlation. So we, based on these observations, we looked at another metric, which is called arousal burden, which is the multiplication of arousal intensity and the arousal index, or AHI, if you want to look at the respiratory events only. And what we observed that the group with high arousal burden, regardless of AHI, they had a greater odds of sleepiness compared to the reference group, which is the low AHI, low arousal burden. And then there was no association between high AHI and low arousal burden and sleepiness. So this data is unpublished and is ongoing work. So the take-home message is that arousal intensity can be measured automatically from PSG, is associated with autonomic response to arousal, is reproducible on repeat testing, and is associated with excessive daytime sleepiness. In summary, from what I showed in these slides, you saw that the respiratory events are not equal. Event characteristic, including severity of desaturation and magnitude of physiological responses to event, predict health outcomes and are important to be included in any OSA severity measure. And finally, prospective randomized control trials are needed to establish mechanisms and confirm these findings. At the end, I'd like to acknowledge all the mentors, collaborators in Winnipeg, in Boston, and everyone else, and all the funding agency who helped, who made this research possible. And thank you for listening to my talk.
Okay, so we have quite a few questions that came in through the presentation. The very first one is, have you looked at sensitivity of hypoxic burden to detect OSA in women?
The sensitivity meaning?
The ability of the hypoxic burden to detect OSA in women.
Yes, it's previous research had shown that women do not desaturate as the same amount as men, but I mean, we are working in this area to look at the sex-specific differences, and we have a grant with a much larger data set to look at that. We have not, but yeah, we're going to look at that. However, based on some preliminary analysis that we've done, is probably women have lower event severity as well. If you quantify it by reduction in airflow, they will have a lower severity. And yes, I agree that we probably need to look at other metrics to better quantify, like arousals, maybe, or increase in heart rate. The women may have a different form of OSA that needs more research to do that. Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much. So the second one is related to the variability in heart rate response, and is the variability in heart rate response between people associated with higher loop gain?
Yes, there is a very weak correlation between loop gain and heart rate response, which is about, I think, about 0.2 or 0.3. They're not very well correlated. Yeah, we think that it's probably more related to the severity of the events and other event characteristics, like the desat magnitude, the desat area, or whether the event is associated with arousal or not. So these may explain a much larger variability in delta heart rate than loop gain does. But oh yeah, we we need additional research to further look at that as well.
Okay, so this one is quite long, so I'll read it and maybe then summarize it if too long. And it says, with some literature not showing OSA determination by AHI only, that CPAP might not improve CVD outcomes. But if you add heart rate variability and hypoxic burden into the diagnostic, this might be different. Seems like integrating hypoxic burden into diagnostic platform is merely a mathematical calculation. Is this accurate? And could Cerebra, for example, integrate this into technology relatively easily?
Yes, I think, yeah, I agree with the comments. And I think, yes, we've been trying to talk with some PSG companies to see if we could actually easily incorporate this, because this will be just an additional measure on a sleep report, and we think it's important and informative, and it's complementary to other metrics that are available on PSG, and this could be easily added to either PSG software or scoring software. Yeah.
So you showed the website that you use with dropping DDF, etc. Would that be? Would it be possible to integrate that website with other applications, for example?
That I don't know, actually. I don't have the answer to that question because that website is developed not by us, but by another company. So I don't know how that works.
Okay, so similar to that question, do you know any diagnostic HSAT or level 2 or 3 devices that include heart rate variability or hypoxic burden? So is there someone that is already doing this?
Yeah, so let me just clarify one point. The measure that we have, it's heart rate response, which is completely different from heart rate variability. And we think that measurements of heart rate variability, especially those based on frequency analysis, are not valid in OSA because of the non-stationarity of the signals. However, the other question was that whether hypoxic burden or heart rate response was added into any current system. I think G3 software, they have a version of hypoxic burden in their system, but I'm not aware of any software who did include heart rate response.
Yeah, thank you for clarifying, because that's important difference. So do some individuals have greater variability in arousal intensity between arousals? And are there any outcomes associated with this variability?
Between arousals, you mean within an individual, there is variability in arousal intensity?
Yes.
Yes, I think there is variability, and that's probably mostly related again to the severity of the events. So if you have a more severe form of event measured by reduction in airflow, desaturation, there is probably a more intense arousal that you see after the termination of the event. We saw that in an analysis we did, we saw that events associated with leg movement, for example, which is usually more severe form of events, they're associated with more intense arousal, or events that happening during REM, they're usually more intense arousal. They end up with a more intense arousal. Yeah.
So the variability is associated more to the strength of the arousal event rather than...
I think it's more related to severity of the respiratory events.
Okay.
That's preceding the arousal.
So this one, it's similar, still on arousal intensity, and ask, did you look at arousal intensity and sleep depth after the arousal, for example, using the ORP9 measure?
We have not. I'm not sure if actually Dr. Yunus has done this. He may have done it, but I have not. No. Yeah.
Maybe revisit the literature or
Yes.
collaborate.
Sure.
And can you combine hypoxic burden and heart rate response?
Combine, I don't know how, but we can report both. We can also report something called heart rate burden, which is the cumulative measure of increase in heart rates during the sleep. But I don't know if we can actually combine heart rate response to and hypoxic burden, because some people may have just low heart rate response to events. Some people just their responsiveness may be different from individual to individual. So yeah.
And
but we
as a
do
follow-up,
yeah, we could probably do some analysis after we have all these metrics to combine them, and then maybe improve prediction of cardiovascular disease. Yeah, those analysis we can.
yeah, I think the follow-up would have been, can you model the two things
Yes.
to get a better prediction?
Yeah. We have done that actually in the sleep heart health. Individual with a high hypoxic burden and high heart rate response, they were particularly at a high increase of CVD, which makes sense.
And do you think the heart rate metric would be affected by patients that are taking beta blockers?
Yes, that's a good question. Yes, we looked at that. I mean, in all the studies that we did, we adjusted or we excluded individuals who were on beta blockers, and we didn't see any meaningful difference between the association of OSA and outcomes if you look at delta heart rate. In overall, I think there is probably about 1 beats per minute decrease. If you look at sleep heart health study, for example, which is 5,000 individual. So individuals who were on beta blocker, they have a lower heart rate response by about 1 beats per minute than those who are not on beta blockers. Yes, so and prevalence of people on beta blocker in the low delta heart rate group are higher, which is probably due to some cardiovascular disease, yes, and other conditions that they have.
So it's hard to disentangle what comes first.
Yeah.
One more, I think, or well, we have time for a few more. So have you codified rules for handling SpO2 values below a certain threshold?
Sorry, can you repeat the question?
Yes. So have you codified rules for handling SpO2 values below a certain threshold?
I don't quite understand the question, but if the question is related to artifacts, then yes, we have some methods to remove artifacts if SpO2 is, let's say, I don't know, 0, if the finger probe is not attached to finger, or if it's moving. If that's the question, yes, we have. But if I don't know if the question could be that maybe those deeper desaturation may be different than milder and longer desats. That's the question. Then we did some analysis in the original paper, and there was no meaningful. So if you give additional weights to deeper desaturations compared to milder desaturations in calculation of hypoxic burden. We didn't find any significant improvement in the prediction of cardiovascular disease or cardiovascular mortality.
Unfortunately, I don't have a follow-up, so I cannot 100% say, but you answer both, so I think it's good. This one is kind of similar to what you had already answered, but is what about combination of different metrics such as AHI, arousal, desaturations to better characterize the sleep apnea severity? Will this be similar or bring similar information as the hypoxic burden alone?
So if we combine AHI, arousal, and compare it with hypoxic burden, is that what the question is?
Yes, so if you combine AHI, arousal, desaturations, and other to better characterize severity of sleep apnea, does this do a better job than hypoxic burden alone?
I don't know the desaturation, I don't know what component of desaturation that is in the question. But I think it would be easier just to calculate hypoxic burden than try to combine all those three together. Yes, and we haven't done any specific analysis combining those metrics and then comparing with hypoxic burden. And the issue that I explained in the beginning was that with AHI, really, you just have the number of events. You're not capturing the severity of the desaturation. Maybe if you have a measure of severity of desaturation, again, but just going through each event and finding the desat depths, for example, and then combine it with AHI, yes, then you get closer to hypoxic burden, yes. But again, it would probably be more difficult. Yeah.
Just go for the straight solution. And then here I have a comment. Thank you very much. I agree with your suggestion about future research on how these variables and others impact how women present with OSA. So this was more of a thumbs up. And okay, so given that there are so many therapies on the market, such as CPAP, BiPAP, INAP, dental appliances, can these metrics be aggregated to predict the best therapy upfront rather than traditional trial and error?
Okay, so that's a good question that I don't have answer for. In terms of what? In terms of identifying individuals who respond to treatment or who get benefit from treatment, because these are two different questions. So if the question is to predict who, for example, benefit from treatment, any treatment regarding a reduction in risk of cardiovascular or neurocognitive outcomes, yes, we can use this. But in terms of treatment response, I'm not sure, how that works.
This just says predict the best therapy, so I guess
best therapy probably in terms of benefits, I guess. Yes, yeah, could be done, I believe. That's a very big study.
I think we covered about all the questions, so I'll just wait a few more seconds to see if some last thoughts come in. If not, we can wrap these up. Yeah, so nothing else coming at the moment, but this was amazing. Thank you so much for giving us this amazing talk, and there will be lots of chances of collaboration from what we just discussed and answered.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Okay, thank you, and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thanks.
Bye.